Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethical Chief Data Officer. I'm your host, Shilpi Agarwal, and founder of DataEthics4All. Today, my guest is the attorney, head of corporate compliance and ethics, and data protection officer at Lidl USA. It's Joe Morocco. Please welcome Joe. Hey, Joe, how are you?
Hi, everybody.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I know we have been chatting for a while, so it's so interesting. Joe has such a unique background. Joe, why don't we start with that? Why don't you tell us? You are an attorney, obviously. You have worked with immigration, and you are the head of corporate compliance. You also are a protection officer. So
Certainly
multi-talented.
a
Yes.
broad remit. So I guess I grew up in Europe and I've been based in the United States after some time between Ireland and Germany. I've been based in the United States almost 6 years now. Irish by birth and by training, but then I licensed as an attorney in the US, qualified to practice in Germany. Initially worked with the UN IOM, the United Nations International Organization for Migration, on international logistics and strategy topics, case management, if you like. Since then, I worked with E.ON. They're a large investor-owned energy company, recently spun off and changed some names, but in Berlin for their HR Shared Service Center. And since then, I've been with Lidl. Lidl are part of the Schwarz Group, the fourth largest retailer globally, as part of their market entry here in the United States. So good mixture of backgrounds. Certainly hope some of my points are interesting for those watching today.
Yes, definitely. No, I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting conversation. I'm sorry
Absolutely.
for having some bandwidth technical issues today. I'm hearing my own echo. If you're hearing that, to please, oh yes. And we are also looking at jumping of screens and videos. So please bear with us. I think we are all overlooking the internet in this challenging times. But today I want to talk to you about GDPR nostalgia and what are the differences, like as a European lawyer, working for a somewhat traditional German company like Lidl, but you're based in US. What do you see as a main differences between the um, direction for privacy and data ethics in terms of US versus Europe?
So I guess obviously as an attorney, I have to say that my views expressed today are mine and not necessarily of the company, but I think everybody understands that.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference, to be honest. It comes ultimately from the cultural differences, many similarities, of course, but some of the cultural differences. I'd like to kind of talk about a couple of maybe specific examples and then maybe some kind of more broad generalizations just to set the tone a little bit. I think as a broad generalization, Europeans have grown up with maybe a healthy skepticism of the state, of their neighbors. And obviously a bit of a simplification, but people are aware that, privacy is deemed as a human right, nearly, absolutely in Europe. Whereas in America, it's nearly the polar opposite. There's a lot of trust in the government for the most part. Again, people joke about that, but for the most part, a lot of trust in the government. So privacy in the US is more of a consumer protection issue. And that's, a polar opposite difference. And I think, especially for an American audience, it's quite interesting to maybe really think why. If you look back and you why did GDPR come out of Europe? Why has Europe been so paranoid about privacy? Why do even the word data subjects as opposed to consumers, but why do Europeans care about this so much? It's a terrible reason, unfortunately, but I think it's worth talking about that. In the last 75 years, nearly every European country has had some kind of a major issue whereby the people didn't trust their government. I'm talking about leaderships. I'm talking about very serious wars. I'm talking about religious oppression. And not just the obvious examples, in various countries where you might think of World War II, etc. I'm thinking about Ireland right up into the early 1990s had people in detention because they had children before they were married. I'm talking about the examples you might not think about as much, maybe Portugal and Spain. They weren't that long ago. But I guess my point is that there are a lot of people still alive today in Europe who grew up with the reality of not trusting the state, who grew up with the reality of a potentially evil government that could collect a lot of information about you and then could use it against you. And I think that stuck. One of the obvious kind of examples that really hit home during my years living in Germany, at the time they were still going through the old Stasi records that had been collected. Ultimately the neighbor that had spied on the other neighbor and had sent that information off. And these records were being released to the folks involved, So you would have had in every apartment block on the street where we lived in Berlin, an elderly neighbor receiving a package, perhaps explaining, information about the neighbor next door who they thought was their best friend, who 30 years ago, more now, certain years ago, had sent information to the state that was used against them. So this is real in a way that maybe. And obviously we'll talk about it more, but maybe it's becoming so in America. But this was kind of a real, genuine topic. I could pick 50 examples across Europe, of course, but I think every state has an example. Maybe there's one or two exceptions, but it's a real topic in Europe because they really felt it and really went through it. Maybe as a kind of very broad generalization to get started, and I hope nobody takes offense to this, but the kind of idea of somebody who's lost in an airport, the European is maybe frustrated why he didn't get, why the signposts aren't good enough, and how this is great. Whereas that the natural response maybe of the American is, well, why is there nobody here for me to ask? And I think that's the point I'm getting to there was obviously European coming to America. That was such a cultural change. And I spent a lot of time in these States as a child. I wouldn't have called it, I wouldn't have been completely naive to American world, but and apologies for making a joke early in this, but I was one of those folks who got completely the wrong impression when the cashier in the grocery store asked for my number as I was during the cash. Something that is absolutely standard here, but would be unbelievably unusual for a European. Not only simply would you like to, but it's just number. The pure acceptance of the fact that somebody would want to identify you, and there's no question about that whatsoever. But I also had some really other difficult examples. Maybe point out a couple, but certainly the local children's hospital here in Washington D.C. have a strange visitor badge process that I think I'd certainly recommend that they reconsider. Certainly, with children in preschool, completely standard here, shocking to me, but standard. To receive a list of all the children's names, all the parents' names, all the parents' occupations, their names, addresses, telephone numbers, everything. That the European and me went to say, I didn't consent to that. This needs to be, but different approaches for different folks. Maybe some of the more kind of subtle ones, and the way the credit ratings work here. The fact that Credit Karma can send me an email. It seems to know when I paid my mortgage before I know myself. Obviously as an attorney, I'd really love to work out how that happened, but all these things are completely standard. I appreciate this is just a different world, and I don't want to trivialize it, but I think it's really important for those who have struggled over the last years who wonder where did GDPR come from? It's crazy, it's onerous, it's a blanket rule. How could we be expected to do this? But I think it's important to understand slight differences in the mindset that came to final one, maybe I'll mention is, the near ridicule when I made my own personal decision to delete my Facebook account. Kind of an assumption, oh, well, is that because you have a problem with your immigration status? Is that, have you something to hide? Are you in witness protection? All genuine questions from friends of ours, in a supportive manner, but, couldn't understand how we would possibly do that, or if we'd ask them, to take down pictures that. Anyway, different approach. But maybe pivoting to kind of the corporate side. Certainly, my role in Germany, I understood kind of data protection law. Admit I wasn't very deeply involved, but it was always working in HR shared service center is always a very important theme throughout all of our work as we establish processes, etc. But the major difference some years ago was that data privacy in America wasn't, back then, in my view, wasn't data privacy. It was data protection. It was always focused on privacy. If you like, the focus on security. How high can we build this fence? Can we put extra cameras on top of the fence? Can we, how do we stop people stealing the data? But never a conversation about, well, do we need this data in the first place, and what do we have it for, and why? And I think that was, from the corporate side, the big change in mentality when I was appointed data protection officer for Lidl US. That was, we had to openly explain what's the difference between my colleague, who's the IT security officer, and my role. And certainly some people took a while to get used to that distinction. But simplifying, I guess, I felt sometimes that the approach was always on IT security rather than privacy per se.
True. It was all about data security. It was what measures are we doing so there are no data hacks, no data breaches. It was all about security. We weren't thinking about privacy, least about ethics and data. How we are collecting it, how we are doing.
No, I mean that was certainly the case some years ago. I think it's starting to change, which is positive, and I guess part of the rationale of today's conversation. But yeah, certainly the focus was on the technical measures that you could put in place, rather than any conversation at all about why did we want this data and what were we going to do with it. Certainly, excluding Lidl, just in case there's any confusion, Lidl definitely takes a very traditional approach, a careful approach. Not just saying that because I'm their data privacy officer, but in general. But more broadly in the market, this was, I felt at least, that the focus was always on the IT security measures, distinct from the kind of bigger picture questions about privacy.
Absolutely. What you mentioned is, I can relate to that. Coming from India, I've been in the US for over 20 years, so it's like, but I grew up in India. So obviously the cultural difference, you can see a stark difference in culture as to what people think as invasion of privacy versus, taking things for granted, is very different in what, how Americans think and how Indians think. And so I can relate to some of the things that you're saying. And yes, we're being abused or whatever by the government in many ways, like Britishers, like our history. Our history is complicated, and how government and other invaders have invaded our privacy and things like that. So it's interesting that we have all started with Cambridge Analytica, with the political campaigns. We have started to become much more aware. Like, I would go to Macy's or any departmental store, and they would say, give us your email address, your phone number, like you were mentioning, for the retail, grocery store, right? And it wasn't considered. Like, one time I asked her, like, why do you need this? And she's like, oh, if you lose a receipt, then, we can email you that, and it's easy for returning and all of that. And we didn't even think twice that this is how they're collecting data. This is how they are putting you on a list. This is how they know what you're buying, what age, what size, what gender, like female, what size, and whatever, right? What all information they can have on you. And it was considered okay. Yeah. We never questioned it until recently.
Yeah, and I think that is starting to change. Yeah. I mean, a couple of reasons why, I guess. Some of them, unfortunately, difficult reasons why. More and more people have had their lives turned upside down because of identity fraud, unfortunately. I think in the past we had the argument of, well, I've nothing to hide, or nearly, well, a data breach is going to happen anyway, so, a sense of powerlessness over it.
Yeah.
Whereas now maybe that's changed. And you mentioned Cambridge Analytica briefly there. What's interesting to see is obviously that has brought a certain skepticism.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's kind of based on a dangerous foreign, I'm not calling out any countries in particular, but obviously, with the investigations in parallel, kind of pointing blame at certain countries. But also it came from this kind of notion that there are these people out here who could do bad things with this data. That was kind of a little bit of a pivot point. But to be honest, and certainly, you do hear some examples at the large online retailers. Obviously, I'm excluding my own background, but certainly not even them, but just that the sales platforms in general, Facebook, etc., and those who sell online directly have more and more power, and that's kind of on people's radar in a way that wasn't there. But to be honest, it's scandal after scandal after scandal that has made some of these changes. Obviously, I know folks working very hard in hotel groups, etc. But the second big announcement this week. I think certainly a week doesn't go by where you don't hear some kind of a huge announcement, which sometimes it's hard to quantify because the numbers are massive. But ultimately, for all the wrong reasons, perhaps. But regardless, people have become more aware, and I think I can see on the horizon like US attitudes beginning to change. I'm not saying European attitudes are better or worse. It's just a different viewpoint, and I think it is a bit of a different ball game. I do a lot of trainings myself, in house primarily, but some in various different settings. And I think in the past we took the approach was quite to the point, let's say, whereas now I think people have a lot of examples where they're aware of this. It doesn't come across anymore as a kind of a this is a European concept, but we should care because, of course, we're a European company. This is no, I want to learn about this. What can I do? Which is a really positive change.
Yeah, I agree. So, are you seeing differences in like the attitude shift towards US and Europe now towards data privacy and things like that? And I've also read about articles where it says that US is more focused on solving this problem through technology, because I think that's our strongest suit. Technology is US strongest suit, so they try to solve this equation through technology. Whereas Europe is trying to solve that equation through the legal law, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Do you mean the current crisis in general? Certainly, we can see that to some extent, but technology, does what it's told for the most part. Obviously, we leave an AI out there a little bit, but what is interesting to see, obviously, is that huge focus on CCPA over the last years. Massive focus. Certainly, contacts of mine who would have had little to no interest in privacy law, high level or even nearly on a partisan basis, have been thrown into the water there. I think that their first experience was, when they realized GDPR was coming their way, and maybe they have operations in Europe and they needed to care, but now all of a sudden it stopped being a European thing and it became, a real topic that they have. Now, still a bit of a, these frustration that California did this and we all have to respond sometimes. But I think that's kind of a point I want to hit, that maybe the crux of the discussion today to some extent. But, really we're seeing for the first time ever, maybe coming back to the Cambridge Analytica or accusations of cyber attacks on voting machines or whatever, we are seeing bipartisan support for change.
Yeah.
What exactly that means is a little bit grey, but obviously there's positives and negatives there. Positive is discussions are happening. People are joining us here today. People are interested in these topics. There's a recognition that there is danger. That there is a genuine risk to people, obviously on the macro level for an individual who could have their identity stolen or could, lose money or have some kind of, even just something on the smaller level, relationships, etc. And then on the macro level, obviously potential impact on democracy and our interactions with the government and attack. But The other positives, obviously, certain examples of the laws we've seen over the last months, which maybe we'll touch on briefly, but a certain amount of return of control to the the consumer more so than the subject, still quite limited in a lot of ways, and maybe also increased consequences of the breaches between fines, but also obviously every notification now, you can nearly expect a class action. It'd be shocking if there wasn't a class action a week or two later. So, obviously increased consequences of when it goes wrong. But, the big focus on California is positive. But on the negative side, there still are it is still obviously a state-by-state approach. This kind of quilted patchwork. Obviously, for the states that want to act, they don't want to wait for the federal government, and it might be hard to find a one-size-fits-all. But on the flip side, having multiple jurisdictions with very different rules does create a genuine difficult task to try and track them all. The principle of subsidiarity in Europe, generally we think of, at what level should the law be placed to make it most efficient, or I'm butchering that definition a little bit, but that makes the most sense to have laws at a certain level. And obviously, it makes sense to have data privacy laws at a pan-EU level, because we're different countries to do it in different ways. It wouldn't make so much sense to have a different. But what we see now is so many states going their own routes that it's very difficult to track, to be honest. Never mind even to make sure to implement them all. And the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, have a very helpful tracker that they release updates to on a rolling basis. And even just if you look at that, I mean, they've been forced to try and split it into categories. Improved consumer rights on one side and business obligations on the other, and that's very helpful. But it's such a complex chart in itself that even to sit and understand the chart might take you some time. Never mind, obviously, get down the road of what you're going to do about it. So maybe on the negatives, I feel there's still quite a clear. It demonstrates the power of the big tech giants, the established tech giants, and I can understand that. And in some ways, you're surprised and maybe proud of California for pushing ahead, even though it would impact them in a lot of ways. Second point is there's obviously still a very strong focus on marketing and consumers, etc. Kind of the pillared approach that HIPAA is over here, and this is a consumer protection topic, and over here is our interactions with the government, let's say, and the government itself. Huge carve-outs. This isn't a blanket kind of approach, but rather, maybe I might go as far as to say, protection against the evil corporation more so than protection against the government, which again, to get anything moving here is a positive thing. Another point I might hit is, still this idea that consent is all powerful. Well, you opted in. It went wrong. Shame on you. Tough. What did you expect? You should have read the small print. Okay.
At least that's changing with CCPA, right? Because now at least the consumers have some power to say, hey, ask questions like, what do you have on me? I want to see everything, delete it. At least they can say no to collection of that data. They can say no to cookies. They can ask for information, and they can deny information.
For sure. No, and I'm not belittling that. That is huge, and a huge step in the right direction. Now, in some examples, it's only that they can say no to the sale, but still, every step is good. Might cause companies to in-house things they previously outsourced, but regardless, that's a huge step in the right direction. But the challenge still there is, are those companies, they can't treat folks within California differently or negatively because they don't agree to this. But obviously, then we're down to a decision of, are we going to treat people in different states differently? Certainly, again, the fact that the conversation is happening at all is really positive. I guess the point that I have some concerns about is that this patchwork creates complexity. That there's a whole, and it's a key issue here. There's a whole new industry has sprung up in the United States, focusing on data privacy topics. We've all these new data privacy experts, alerts day to day, but for the most part, their focus is on the services they can provide to help you to navigate this complexity of the multi-jurisdictional challenge. Whereas obviously in my own heart, and maybe some of the viewers here today, we'd hope that, of course, yes, let's follow the law, but in parallel that it would spin off, and it will in time, but a broader conversation about ethics and where we're actually going here, as distinct from simply just making sure we're ticking the boxes of the state requirements. Yeah.
And as an attorney, I have to ask you this question: do you feel like when you read the document, like, do you understand everything? I talked to some chief data officers at Fortune 500 companies, and this is their take. Their feel is that the verbiage on that is so complicated that no matter what you do, the government can come after you. They can bring you for anything. Even if you are putting all the checks and taking some time, they can come after you. So is it that complicated? What do you think?
It's not short. I presume we're talking about the CCPA here specifically, but across the board, it's certainly not short. It certainly takes some reading. We can see that there's still more and more guidance from the AG in California about how it should be implemented post fact nearly. Obviously, there's efforts and consulting with industry leaders to go back to make various changes. Again, I think a lot of what they're trying to achieve is probably quite positive. It's not an easy law to sit down and just write. I can imagine there's a lot of interest groups with strong opinions one way or the other. But on the flip side, some of those points where some of those arguments were made against GDPR some years ago. And to be clear, I appreciate people on the call here may not all be GDPR fans, or certainly it might have made a hard life for them for a couple of months, a year or two ago in particular. But certainly those arguments were made at the time GDPR was rolled out, despite quite a long implementation period before the directive came into force. Ultimately, it's an easy focus area if you don't want to make the change. But certainly, I think we'd have to admit that there is a lot of complexity there. I mean, obviously, there are some laws on the books already, in New York and various other locations. But my point is that even if the CCPA were very simplistic, the fact that you have 15, 20, 25 of them to understand and navigate in itself, it takes away, in my view, from the ethical opportunity to move forward. I think, obviously, even another, maybe an easy example is very different rules about breach notification, timing, content, what you must say, what constitutes a breach, etc. Again, just another example of the pressures that complexity puts to manage that complexity and ensure what I might call checkbook compliance. Obviously, again, it has positives and negatives, but one of the negatives are that it takes away from the focus on the bigger picture of where we're going here. And I think that's one of the things I've really tried to do, again, not just internally in my role with Lidl, who again are quite conservative on the privacy side, but certainly kind of more broadly. And again, like I said at the start, my own opinions and positions here, not necessarily the opinions of the company, but are to really kind of talk about that is, where are we going in the longer term? And I think one thing I will say that is quite positive is I have seen, companies and data protection officers I've spoken to all across the country who aren't currently really subject to GDPR. They don't have the 50,000 data subjects. Their focus isn't really on data, even though they collect data that they're otherwise in a different industry. They don't have actually any extra operational business there, etc. Arguably, obviously, will still have tangential links via vendors and suppliers and their, etc. Not to minimizing that, but who have ultimately made the decision to try to implement CCPA regardless, for a couple of reasons. One is because they think this or something similar is coming their way anyway, so better to be prepared. But on the flip side, kind of a feeling that maybe the customer might start to demand it. When you see, if you're from California, you have these rights, but everyone else doesn't. So I think that's kind of a positive. But maybe kind of coming back a little bit more to the ethics a bit more difficultly. And I don't want to be overly negative, but so some of my fears, my big, and I've expressed it, is kind of that the complexity will take over and we'll lose sight of the actual goals here. It's a bit of a toss-up. Do we prefer, a weak patchwork of laws, some maybe strong, some weak, or do we really want to try and get what we want? I don't know the answer to that for sure, but very interested, to continue to monitor that over the
Do you
weeks and
think,
months.
in your opinion, just like we have one GDPR for the whole Europe, would it make sense to have something like that, one law for the whole state?
To be honest, I think some of your viewers might hate me for saying this, but I do think so. Yes, I do get the sense at the conferences I go to at this point, and when I meet with other folks focused on privacy, with the exception, of course, of the law firms who are have their services to provide, and that they do a good job at that too. But I think at a certain point, there are some of us in the industry who might prefer even one very strict rule that we understand that we can certainly follow, as distinct from an ever-moving patchwork of different rules. Like every time I hear some kind of a huge new scandal, I think this is the one that's going to really change people's opinions, and the consumers will demand change. And every time I'm wrong, which I think over time it is having the positive effect, and I think America is really starting to ask serious questions about these topics. Now, on the flip side, obviously, we have the current crisis, the COVID topic, which I think a lot of folks are probably happy to not talk about for a few days, so we won't get into it today. But in some ways, obviously, there's a risk there that they will step backwards as a result of it. Obviously, there's a need for some innovative, weird and wonderful ideas, to first priority is to tackle this crisis. But certainly from my side, when hopefully it's all over rather soon, we can really kind of go back to put the data subject as king and kind of start to move down that direction. There's three kind of focus areas. Maybe to appreciate we're running over time a little bit here, but three kind of focus areas. One is, I guess, what I'd love to see in the years ahead. I'd love to see, focus on not just on the consumer or the marketing efforts, but kind of a broader data subject law that doesn't just focus on that. Your data, you yourself, you might not care so much if somebody's interested about some product that you might be interested in purchasing. It might be quite convenient, in fact. But on the flip side, you might be more concerned about voting rights or how it could impact democracy, etc. So currently, there's a lot of carve-outs there. So I'd like to see certainly protection for family information, location information. They're important to me, and I think they are. When people are really asked, I think that is important to a lot of folks. The second one is one that I think you mentioned a little bit earlier. Do you understand what you're consenting to here? The consent means consent for sure, but we need a plain English understanding here. When those cookie banners come up and they're in the way, and you have to click them to make them go away. Okay, but did you really understand what you were consenting to? And I think that the plain English argument is still missing here. I think it's coming, but I think it's very vital. And then my last one, which is really, I guess, the main point I want to make today, is that I think us who are interested in data ethics as distinct, or in addition to, of course, data privacy more generally, we need more champions for privacy. So, obviously I have a broader role in risk and different topics. And in those other focus areas of mine, there's a constant conversation about being an ethical champion and doing the right thing for the right reason, which I haven't seen as much in the data privacy world just yet. So, obviously, if we could be as successful as maybe corporate compliance and ethics industry, but, to start talking about privacy and ethics or ethical privacy, I think that would be really positive if we can convince some of those folks who come into the industry to really kind of be champions for ethics going forward.
Wow, I think you touched on a very, very important point champions in ethics that also understand privacy. I think that's the key, because we are looking at it from a data scientist point of view, from an AI point of view, ethics and data from all different points of view. But I think we are not, and from security, we have considered it from a very long time. But we aren't really paying attention to the data protection and privacy from that point of view. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We need to start. So how do you think we can champion that effort? Like what are your suggestions on what we can do to champion that effort?
Well, I think some of the biggest challenges are obviously to try and convince people that it's key and it's valuable and that we can get there. I think in the past there's been a kind of a top-down mentality of well, these are the laws coming, let's just make sure we follow them. To be honest, I think maybe a more blanket law or a federal law actually comes in at some point on the cards for a while. Let's see if it goes anywhere. But I think that will take away from the stress point and the challenge in trying to track all the multi-jurisdictional differences, and that might free up some time to focus on other areas. But to be honest, it's like always, it's a person by person, one by one. I don't think America it would be excited about GDP or USA just yet, but step by step, and I think obviously conversations like this and various movements are a step in that right direction. But to be honest, on the flip side, then maybe it's a few more big scandals, and it'll cause people to really question where things are going. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm hoping for the best.
Yeah, we learn our lesson before any more scandals, right? I mean, hopefully we are able to convince the government to come up with a more blanket and more law instead of just having CCPA in California. Hopefully we are able to champion that.
Yeah, I know we can see big steps forward in New York, and I think as the complexity reaches a level that's intolerable, let's say, for industry, what we might see is some kind of a uniform act that various other states all implement, even if a federal one doesn't come, reduce the level a little bit. But ultimately, to try and create a law for data when data flows everywhere, but to try to do it by the map is a difficult topic. I didn't plan on mentioning it today, but maybe you could go a step forward, and maybe we shouldn't have a GDPR and GDPR USA, but maybe they should, if they were all one and the same, would that not be simpler again? But anyway, I think I'm being a bit optimistic there for now.
Yeah, no, this is good. I do have so many follow-up questions, but I think we'll save them for another session. There's a lot more to cover. This is a very interesting topic. Thank you, Joe, for spending time with us today. I see Ulysses. Thank you for joining us, and everybody else who is going to watch the replay. Please enjoy and feel free to reach out to us. Joe and I are available on LinkedIn as well as in the Data Ethics for All community. And we welcome you to join us there and continue this conversation. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of the Ethical Chief Data Officer, and signing off with Joe. Bye, Joe. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.